In 1945, Tokyo was flattened by the final waves of B-29 bombings of the war, with more than 40% of Japan's industry destroyed. Lines of people queuing for rations appeared throughout the ruined neighborhoods. The yen collapsed in value, black markets spread everywhere, and a nation that had once been Asia's dominant power now faced starvation, collapse, and the complete loss of sovereignty.Fast-forward to Tokyo in 1964. The opening day of the Olympics. Unemployment was virtually zero. The post-war soup kitchen lines had vanished. In their place stood a new industrial Japan, the first Shinkansen bullet train running at 200 kilometers per h, electronics, steel, and automobile factories operating at full capacity, and made in Japan, goods beginning to flood into America and Europe. This seemingly impossible transformation from a defeated nation with no oil, no steel, no foreign currency reserves to a technological superpower in less than 2 decades was not an accident. It was meticulously engineered by a network of technocrats centered around the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI. The agency, nicknamed the secret brain behind Japan's economic miracle, together with a set of unique industrial strategies that appeared to defy every known economic limit. So how exactly did they do it? And what can the world today still learn from Japan's post-war economic technological miracle? In this story, I will show you not only the tools Japan used to rebuild its economy from the ashes, but also how those tools reshaped the global balance of power and why the economic choices made then propelled Japan to technological superpower status. Finally, I will tell the story of the quiet architects behind this miracle, the people who never appeared on propaganda posters, and how they built a model the world is still trying to copy today. This is the economic technological miracle that changed the global order. To understand Japan's economic technological miracle, we must start with what came before it. An empire that completely collapsed in 1945. Before the war, the Empire of Japan had been Asia's fastest industrializing power, expanding its influence from Manchuria to Southeast Asia. But that rapid industrialization relied heavily on militarism, colonies, and control of overseas resources. When the war ended, that entire system vanished in just a few months. In 1945, Japan didn't just lose territory, it lost sovereignty itself. For the first time in its history, the country was occupied by a foreign power. The American Occupation Authority, GHQ SCAP, under General MacArthur, held absolute control over everything from politics and the economy to the media. And yet, it was precisely during this period that appeared to be total collapse that the foundations for the later miracle were quietly but thoroughly laid. GHQ began by dissolving the zaibatsu, the giant family-controlled conglomerates that had dominated nearly 95% of pre-war Japanese industry. Families like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo were forced to sell assets and break up their companies. This didn't just dismantle concentrated economic power, it created space for a new, fairer, and far more flexible industrial structure that would emerge later. At the same time, sweeping land reform was carried out. GHQ compelled landlords to sell land to tenant farmers at low prices, turning millions of tenant farmers into small landowners. Agricultural productivity soared, domestic purchasing power grew, and most importantly, the countryside became a stable social base, unlike the chaos seen in many other defeated nations. Japan didn't just restructure its economy, its entire political system was rebuilt from the ground up. The 1947 Constitution turned Japan into a parliamentary democracy with a strong legislature, clear individual rights, an independent press, and legal labor unions. These changes didn't produce instant growth, but they created a more transparent society with fewer privileges and one that was far easier to steer with coherent policy, the very thing Japan would exploit to the fullest over the next 2 decades. Beneath the new political surface lay a completely different economic structure from the old imperial era. Commercial banks became the center of development. Instead of a militarized state making the decisions, banks backed by the central bank and government policy now took on the role of providing long-term capital to industry. This was the foundation of the future main bank system and the Keiretsu networks. Education was completely overhauled. Secondary education became universal, universities expanded rapidly, and math, science, and engineering were made the core curriculum. Japan produced a generation of engineers, managers, and skilled workers that no other Asian country at the time could match. On the social level, the culture of discipline, collective spirit, and community responsibility which had already existed before the war did not disappear after defeat. On the contrary, they became natural competitive advantages for Japanese society during the Reconstruction period. Yet none of these strengths could hide the harsh reality. Post-1945, Japan was an economy that lacked virtually every natural condition for growth. Like Germany after World War I, Japan faced three extremely severe constraints: no raw materials, no foreign currency, and near total dependence on imports. Japan had no oil, no rubber, no high-quality iron ore. Everything had to come from outside. But after the war, transportation infrastructure and ports had been bombed to ruins, the power grid was destroyed, and the production system was almost completely paralyzed. Even if the Japanese wanted to restart development, they had no raw materials, no machinery, no fuel, and no foreign exchange to buy what they needed. In other words, Japan could not yet grow because the physical, financial, and commercial foundations simply did not exist. A disciplined nation with a hard-working population and a fierce will to rise, but missing the most basic conditions to even get started. And right at the moment when everything seemed permanently closed off, the events that followed would open a path no one could have predicted, the path to an economic technological miracle that the world is still studying to this day. After those foundational reforms, Japan entered a phase that any economist would describe in two words: instability. From 1946 to 1948, hyperinflation exploded at a pace that rendered the yen nearly worthless. Prices doubled in just a few months, food became scarce, and the black market became the only place still operating according to the laws of supply and demand. The Japanese people no longer trusted their own nation's currency. An economy already destroyed by bombs was now further paralyzed by its own money. To halt this collapse, in 1949, the United States imposed a drastic tightening policy, remembered as the Dodge Line, named after the economist Joseph Dodge. It was the strongest fiscal monetary shock ever applied to post-war Japan, slashing public spending, ending subsidies, balancing the budget immediately, and tightening credit so severely that businesses could barely borrow anything at all. The yen was pegged at 360 yen to 1 USD, a deliberately undervalued rate meant to lay the groundwork for future exports, even though it offered no immediate benefit at the time. The consequences hit instantly. Recession. Factories shut down, companies went bankrupt, unemployment soared, and people grew even poorer. Japan had barely escaped hyperinflation only to plunge straight into a deep recession, a double blow powerful enough to collapse an already exhausted nation. By late 1949, many American economists feared that Japan, instead of recovering, might spiral into total economic collapse. A country without sovereignty, without raw materials, without foreign currency, without capital, without trust, stood right on the edge of the abyss. Then, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out, and overnight Japan's future changed. The U.S. military, stationed in Japan, and needing logistics immediately, began buying from the local economy: trucks, tires, steel, radios, communications equipment, canned food, uniforms, aircraft, and warship repair services. These orders were called special procurements, and they became the most unexpected lifeline in modern economic history. Factories that had been shuttered for lack of work lit up again. Steel mills ran at full capacity. Shipbuilding revived. The transportation system operated non-stop. Newly established electronics companies, like Sony, which was still struggling to survive, suddenly received military contracts worth an entire year's revenue. These were not just commercial contracts. They were seed capital. They were foreign currency. They were a signal that Japan once again had a role in the global supply chain, and most importantly, they were time. Time for Japan to repair its factories, accumulate capital, import new equipment, and retrain its skilled workforce. Within 3 years, Japan accumulated more US dollars than it had in the entire 1945-1949 period combined. With that foreign currency, Japanese companies bought American machinery, German production lines, and began rebuilding their industry at a pace that was almost unbelievable. If Germany had its turning point when Hitler seized power during the crisis, Japan had its own pivotal moment in 1950, not because of a dictator, but because of a major geopolitical event beyond its borders. The United States unintentionally gave Japan what the country lacked: foreign exchange, markets, industrial demand, and breathing room. From an economy teetering on the brink, Japan suddenly had a chance at rebirth. And from that moment on, Japan did not merely recover. It prepared to enter a period of growth that the world would later call by a familiar name: miracle. In the entire structure of Japan's economic, technological miracle, no organization played a more central and decisive role than MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. If one had to pick the brain that operated in the shadows, designing the path for the whole economy, MIDI was that place. Quietly, without speeches or fanfare, every decision it made in the 1950s and 1960s shaped the growth trajectory of an entire nation. Right after the war, Japan could not do everything at once. Foreign currency was scarce, raw materials were in short supply, and industry lay in ruins. MIDI understood that trying to rebuild every sector simultaneously would cause Japan to fail right from the starting line. So they chose a simple yet bold strategy: concentrate the nation's resources on exactly 6 priority industries that could create long-term competitive advantage: steel, shipbuilding, petrochemicals, electronics, automobiles, and machine tools. These 6 industries did not emerge by chance. MIDI analyzed global markets, assessed Japan's technical workforce capabilities, and forecasted which sectors would become the engines of global manufacturing for decades to come. At the heart of this strategy was control of foreign exchange. In the post-war era, US dollars were more precious than gold. No company was allowed to freely use foreign currency to import machinery or components. MIDI held the keys. It allocated every dollar to the priority industries, turning foreign exchange into a strategic steering tool. Companies outside the selected sectors could barely access foreign technology at all. Running parallel was a deliberate licensing system. MIDI negotiated the purchase of patents from the United States and Europe, then forced Japanese firms to improve, localize, and upgrade the technology rather than merely assemble it. MIDI's long-term plans, spanning 5 or 10 years, set clear targets: increasing steel productivity, lowering shipbuilding costs, raising the domestic content ratio in automobiles, and building domestic capability to produce electronic components. Each industry had its own roadmap of preferential interest rates, import quotas, technical standards, and export support commitments. MIDI did not just pick industries, they picked Japan's future. It was precisely this focus, discipline, and long-term vision that made MIDI the central brain of the entire post-war miracle, the place that designed the very first steps that lifted Japan from the ashes to become the world's leading industrial and technological power. If MIDI was the brain of the Japanese economic miracle, then foreign currency, especially the US dollar, was the lifeblood that determined whether that brain could function at all. After the war, Japan had no oil, no high-quality iron ore, no rubber, no bauxite, and not even enough food. To revive any industry, Japan had to import raw materials, but to import, Japan needed USD, and USD at that time was scarcer than any natural resource. Therefore, MIDI turned foreign currency into a strategic tool, a cold but extraordinarily effective economic weapon. No Japanese company was free to use USD on its own. Every dollar earned from exports, from American aid, or from Korean War procurement orders had to be surrendered to the banking system and could only be released with MIDI's approval. MIDI made no secret of this. They openly declared USD would only be allocated to industries that were vitally important to Japan's industrial future. This created a rationing mechanism similar to quotas in a planned economy, yet it was completely legal, transparent, and aimed solely at development rather than concealment. Companies that wanted to import equipment had to submit applications clearly stating what they were importing, from where, for which industry, and how it would benefit the nation's export strategy. MIDI needed only one simple authority to say yes or no. And that authority shaped the entire trajectory of the economy. The steel industry was given priority foreign exchange to import blast furnaces and basic oxygen technology. The shipbuilding industry was allowed to import steel plate and large engines. The electronics industry was permitted to buy American transistors and Bell Labs technology. The automobile industry gained access to body stamping equipment, engines, and production lines. Meanwhile, consumer industries, fashion, luxury goods, cheap household appliances, received almost no foreign exchange at all. It wasn't that MIDI hated those sectors. Japan simply did not have enough dollars to spread around. Every single dollar had to become a brick laid into the industries capable of propelling Japan into the top rank of global industry. This is exactly why MIDI was able to concentrate the nation's entire resources on precisely 6 strategic sectors. And it was thanks to this tight foreign exchange allocation system that Japan avoided the chaos commonly seen in post-war economies: no flood of indiscriminate imports, no dependency on consumer goods, and no waste of scarce resources. The US dollar became a strategic weapon, and MIDI was the one wielding it. In parallel with foreign exchange control, MIDI deployed a third decisive tool: infant industry protection. Japan fully understood that if it had opened its doors completely from the early 1950s, domestic companies would never have had a chance to grow. No local steelmaker could have competed with US Steel. No fledgling automaker could have withstood the might of Ford or GM. No newly established electronics company would have been able to stand up to RCA or Philips. Therefore, MIT erected a strategic shield, a protective barrier that gave key industries time to accumulate capital, master technology, and build production capacity before entering the global arena. The first tool was high import tariffs on finished steel, automobiles, electronics, and machinery from the United States and Europe. The goal was not to isolate Japan, but to buy time for domestic firms to learn, improve, and reach sufficient economies of scale. The second tool was restrictions on FDI, especially prohibiting foreign companies from gaining controlling stakes in strategic sectors. Japan was willing to accept technology, but it would not allow foreign conglomerates to dominate the domestic market. The third tool was preferential credit. Companies in priority industries gained access to cheap long-term capital from the banking system. All of these measures combined to form a protective shield thick enough for Japan's industrial infants to grow up without being crushed by premature international competition. And when that shield was finally lifted in the late 1960s, the world discovered that the industries once protected were no longer children, they had become giants. Once the fledgling industries had a solid foundation, MIT deployed its next tool, turning Japan into an export machine. The key to this strategy was the exchange rate fixed at 360 yen to 1 USD, which remained unchanged for more than 2 decades. At that level, Japanese goods were so cheap that almost no competitor in the American or European markets could match them on price. But low price was only half the story. At the same time, MIT imposed an unprecedentedly strict system of quality standards on every single export product, from radios, televisions, and steel parts to motorcycles and automobiles. They understood that cheap prices could open markets, but only quality could hold on to them. Japanese companies, Sony, Toyota, Honda, Toshiba, entered a race to raise quality at an almost unimaginable speed, adopting total quality control, gradually automating production lines and continuously improving designs. When Americans imported Japanese goods, they expected them to be cheap. What surprised them was that Japanese products lasted. In the 1960s, streams of Japanese electronics and automobiles began flooding into the United States, not as low-quality bargain items, but as genuine replacements for domestic products. American consumers chose Japanese goods not just because of the price, but because they broke down less often, used less fuel, and were easier to maintain. This was the moment when the export-oriented strategy revealed its full power. Large-scale production further lowered costs. Lower costs, expanded markets, fueled technological investment. Japan was not just exporting goods. Japan was exporting industrial capability. And by competing directly on America's home turf, they proved that their economic miracle was not a product of luck, but the result of a strategy designed down to the smallest detail. To sustain an export race that demanded constant investment in cutting-edge technology and machinery, Japan needed something that most post-war economies simply did not have: long-term, stable, risk-tolerant capital. This is where the Keiretsu system and the main bank model took center stage. In this model, major companies from steel and automobiles to electronics were tightly intertwined with a core bank. The bank held shares in the companies held shares in the bank, and both sides were bound together by a dense web of long-term cooperative relationships. This created what the West calls patient capital. When a Japanese firm needed to pour money into automated production lines, assembly robots, brand new steel furnaces, or hugely expensive semiconductor technology, the bank did not demand immediate returns. It was willing to lend at low interest rates with long repayment periods and to absorb short-term losses for the sake of long-term strategic gains. With no shareholder pressure to maximize next quarter's profits and no fear of hostile takeover during temporary setbacks, Japanese companies could throw everything into technological innovation. Toyota could invest heavily in the Toyota Production System, TPS. Sony could take risks on the transistor, then the Walkman, and later the CD. Nippon Steel could build the world's most advanced blast furnaces. All of this was possible because behind them stood banks that were prepared to take the hits together and share the rewards together over long cycles. The system also minimized the risk of cascading bankruptcies. The main bank would step in to rescue a member company before it collapsed. As a result, Japan maintained a stable, low-risk environment that allowed relentless investment in technology, giving it an advantage that American and European rivals, burdened by much heavier short-term financial pressures, struggled to match. This was the hidden financial foundation that kept Japan's industrial miracle running smoothly for decades. In parallel with long-term capital from the main bank system, Japan deployed a decisive technology strategy: absorb, copy, and improve. MIT and Japanese companies understood that they could not wait decades to invent everything from scratch. The fastest way to become an industrial superpower was to take in advanced technology from the United States and Germany, then improve it to the point of surpassing the very people who created it. As early as the 1950s, Japan massively purchased patents, production lines, and technology licenses, Bell Labs, transistors, basic oxygen steel-making processes, German machine tools, American automobile engines, European radio and television equipment. But instead of mere assembly, Japanese engineers tore each item apart to learn how it worked. They measured, tested, changed materials, reduced size, cut costs, increased durability. Every product was Japanized, made to run more reliably, more efficiently, and easier to maintain. Japanese electronics went from assembling transistors, improving transistors, producing better transistors than anyone else. The machine tool industry learned from Germany, improved precision, became the world leader. The auto industry studied American engines, redesigned them for fuel efficiency, created cars that crushed Detroit in the 1970s. This was the fast follower strategy, not trying to lead from the very start, but running right behind the leader, learning from their mistakes, and overtaking them through relentless, continuous improvement. The key was speed every year. Japanese products became cheaper, smaller, more durable, and less defective. By the late 1960s, many technologies that Japan had once learned from the West had been improved to the point that the West was now buying them back from Japan. Through this strategy of learning fast and improving fast, Japan did not merely close the technology gap, it erased it completely. But all the purchased technology, all the long-term capital investment, and every industrial strategy would have been meaningless if Japan had not possessed one resource that few countries own at a comparable scale: a disciplined, highly skilled workforce that treats work as a matter of personal honor. This is the foundation that created Japan's long-term advantage in the Japanese economic miracle. As early as the beginning of the 1950s, Japan launched sweeping education reforms, expanding secondary education, dramatically increasing the number of technical schools and universities, and making mathematics, science, technology, STEM the central axis of training. In a single generation, Japan produced one of the largest and most capable cohorts of engineers, managers, and skilled workers in all of Asia. But knowledge alone was not enough. Japan's employment system was built on the philosophy of lifetime employment. Once you joined Toyota, Hitachi, or Toshiba, you would almost certainly work there for your entire career. This model reduced internal competition, allowing employees to openly share improvements and experiment without fear of losing their jobs over temporary failures. In return, companies invested heavily in long-term training. Workers didn't just learn skills, they learned how the entire production system operated. This created a workforce that didn't merely follow processes, but deeply understood the purpose behind them. And in that environment, two famous philosophies were born: Kaizen and QC circles. Kaizen promoted continuous improvement. Every worker was encouraged to find defects, fix them, and propose new solutions. QC circles, quality control circles, brought workers together in small groups to analyze, monitor, and evaluate production processes, treating quality as everyone's shared responsibility rather than the sole duty of an end-of-line inspection department. These small, daily, repeated improvements accumulated into leaps in productivity that the West could not comprehend for 2 full decades. While European workers went on strike, Japanese workers voluntarily worked overtime. While American factories argued over product defects, QC circles had already solved the problem before the defects even appeared. From ordinary classrooms to automated assembly lines, Japan created a workforce that was disciplined, highly specialized, and possessed a sense of responsibility rarely seen anywhere else in the world. This was the quiet yet most powerful engine of the Japanese economic miracle, the human technology of Japan. And to complete that picture, Japan possessed one additional advantage that no industrial strategy anywhere could ever replace: a population with the highest savings rate in the world. Throughout the 1950s, 1970s, Japanese households saved an average of 20–25% of their income, a figure that even the Western industrial economies of that era could not come close to matching. This created an enormous pool of domestic capital that flowed straight into the banking system, the very same banks that served as the main bank within the Keiretsu conglomerates. The result was that Japan could fully self-finance its own industrialization. They did not need to borrow from abroad. No pressure from exchange rates on USD-denominated loans. No dependence on Wall Street or international financial institutions. Japanese banks mobilized such massive savings that they could extend long-term, low-interest loans to companies, regardless of short-term profitability. This was the key difference from the West, where the financial system was dominated by quarterly profits, shareholders demanding instant growth, and long-term investment risk was severely constrained. In Japan, Ordinary people saved, banks took those savings and poured them into heavy industry, technology, machinery, and automation. And the entire cycle was sustained steadily over decades. As households kept saving, companies kept getting capital. As companies had capital, they kept investing. As investment rose, productivity rose, incomes rose, and rising incomes in turn fueled even more savings. It was a self-reinforcing, virtuous circle that few economies have ever been able to create. In the end, all the pieces, MITI's strategic planning, precise allocation of foreign exchange, protection of infant industries, export-led growth, long-term capital from main banks, technology absorption, a STEM-trained workforce and culture of discipline, combined with massive domestic savings, fit together to form a complete growth machine. The Japanese miracle was not an accident. It was designed, built piece by piece, and nurtured by an entire nation over decades. That is why the world called it a miracle. But in reality, it was a miracle created by human hands. However, even a perfect growth machine like Japan could not escape the limits of the real world. And those limits arrived in the form of two global shocks, the oil crises of 1973 and 1979. For Japan, a country that imported almost all of its oil, these were not just economic shocks, they were direct blows to the very foundation of its entire growth model. Oil prices tripled, then quadrupled, paralyzing the steel, cement, petrochemical, and entire heavy industry sectors. Industries that had been the pillars of growth from 1955-1970 suddenly became burdens because of their massive energy consumption. Steel mills operated well below capacity. Shipyards were clogged with unsold inventory. Petrochemicals were strangled by skyrocketing input costs. What had been unimaginable a decade earlier now happened. The heavy industry's first model that MITI had painstakingly built hit its ceiling. Not because Japan had done anything wrong, but because the world's resource base had changed. Oil, the energy foundation of the entire miracle, had become a hard limit. Japan faced a life-or-death choice: continue relying on heavy industry and slide into prolonged stagnation, or completely restructure its entire development model. MITI understood that the era of steel, ships, petrochemicals could no longer remain dominant. If Japan was to survive, it had to shift to a new model, one that used more knowledge, less energy, and created higher value. And this is where Japan once again proved its difference. It changed its model and rose for the second time. MITI launched a new strategy, every bit as bold as the original one. Shift the center of gravity from heavy industry to knowledge industries, high technology sectors, sophisticated electronics, automation, robotics, and ultra-precision machine tools. Immediately, MITI rolled out a series of policies aimed at energy-efficient, high-value-added technologies. Microelectronics, MITI poured massive investment into semiconductors, integrated circuits, and next-generation transistor manufacturing technology. Industrial robots. Japan took the global lead in factory automation, using robots to boost productivity and cut labor costs. Fuel-efficient automobiles. While American cars guzzled gas, Japan developed the Civic, Corolla, and Sunny, affordable, reliable, and highly fuel-efficient models that crushed Detroit throughout the 1970s. Precision machine tools. Japan pushed CNC technology forward, producing the world's most accurate machine tools and supplying them to the United States and Europe. All of these policies did not merely protect Japanese companies, they repositioned the entire economy, turning crisis into opportunity. While the rest of the world struggled to adapt to high oil prices, Japan fully pivoted to low-energy consumption technology and redefined its role in global value chains. From 1975 onward, this shift triggered a new wave of growth. Japan became the world's capital of electronics manufacturing, leading in color televisions, semiconductors, cameras, and camcorders, dominating industrial robotics, and conquering the American car market, where Detroit began losing market share dramatically. Most importantly, Japan did not allow the energy crisis to destroy its economy the way Germany had once been crippled by resource shortages. Instead, Japan recognized the limits and restructured faster than any other industrialized nation. It moved from a resource-based economy to a knowledge-based economy, from steel to silicon, from energy-intensive output to energy efficiency, from a volume-driven model to a value-added model. And because of that, Japan maintained its growth momentum and continued to assert itself as one of the most creative, flexible, and resilient economies of the 20th century. Much of the world looked at it and called it a miracle. But in reality, this was a second miracle once again designed, not accidental. However, when the knowledge industries model propelled Japan into a phase of powerful technological growth in the 1980s, a quiet shift in power took place, not due to political crisis or internal conflict, but precisely because of the success of the earlier industrialization strategy. For 3 decades, from 1950 to 1980, MITI had been the central coordinator of the entire Japanese economy. But then, the very conglomerates that MITI had nurtured, Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, Honda, grew so large that they no longer needed MITI to lead the way. They built their own massive research laboratories, independently developed core technologies, and decided their own global strategies. Toyota created the lean production system, TPS, not because MITI designed it, but because their own engineers invented it. Sony shaped the global consumer audio and electronics industry with the Walkman, CD, and image sensors, technologies that lay entirely outside any state plan. Panasonic, Toshiba, and Hitachi expanded their supply chains to the United States, Europe, and Southeast Asia, becoming global technology empires. The simple truth was once companies had become giants, they no longer followed MIT's directives. They began charting their own paths. This happened just as Japan entered a new economic context. The 1985 Plaza Accord caused the yen to surge, stripping Japanese exports, which had been the growth engine for 3 decades of their price advantage. To cushion the negative impact, Japan slashed interest rates. Cheap money flooded into real estate and stocks, inflating the asset bubble of 1985-1990, the largest in modern history. At the bubble's peak, land in central Tokyo was worth more than the entire United States. But when the bubble burst in 1990, Japan entered a long period of adjustment. Growth slowed, corporate profits were squeezed, and the government no longer had the ability to impose direction as it once did. This was not the collapse of Japan or a political failure. It was the natural transition phase of a mature economy. As Japanese technology conglomerates gained global strength, they became the new leading force, while MITI gradually retreated to an advisory role rather than direct coordination. Japan shifted from the miracle high growth model to a saturated growth model, less explosive, but more stable and higher quality. There was no longer a need to grow 10% a year. Instead, the focus turned to technological innovation, automation, robotics, new materials, and precision manufacturing. This transfer of power did not create chaos. It reflected the fact that Japan had completed its industrialization phase and entered maturity. The MITI was not overthrown, it simply fulfilled its historical role. Japanese companies did not break the system. They inherited it and carried it into the next stage of development. This was not the end of the miracle, but its natural evolution. As power gradually shifted from MITI to giant technology conglomerates, and the economy entered its mature phase, Japan moved into the post-miracle era, a period in which explosive growth was no longer the central story, but what the miracle left behind truly defined modern Japan. By the end of the 20th century, Japan had become one of the wealthiest, most stable, and most technologically advanced nations on Earth. Per capita GDP ranked among the world's highest, near universal healthcare coverage. Crime rates the lowest among developed economies. Japanese society became the world's largest middle-class society, where the majority of citizens owned their homes, had savings, had health insurance, and had access to high-quality education. These achievements did not appear by chance. They were the result of 3 decades of miraculous growth driven by industrial policy and societal effort. In technology, Japan no longer grew at the explosive rates of the 1960s, 1980s, yet it retained a dominant position in the foundational industries of global manufacturing, electronic components, sensors, capacitors, industrial semiconductors, things that never appear in advertisements but are present in every smartphone and every car on the planet. Industrial robots, Japan accounted for more than half of all manufacturing robots worldwide. Precision machine tools, Germany and Japan were the absolute superpowers in this field, and Japan played a critical role in global supply chains. However, the post-miracle era was not all brightness. Japan faced a triple challenge: rapid aging, population decline, and slow adaptation to the internet era. The world's longest-lived society was also the fastest aging. The working-age population shrank, domestic consumption gradually weakened over time. From 2000 onward, Japan also lost its edge in the internet and software revolution, a field dominated by the United States and in which South Korea and China rose powerfully. Former global icons such as Sony and Panasonic struggled to pivot to software-centric business models. Yet despite these challenges, the legacy of the Japanese miracle remains extraordinarily solid. Post-miracle Japan is still a peaceful, democratic society with high educational attainment, advanced technological infrastructure, and one of the most livable places in the world. No wars, No hyperinflation, no widespread social violence, no collapse of the middle class, an economy that no longer grows at miraculous speed, but remains wealthy and safe with a quality of life among the very best on earth. In other words, the Japanese miracle did not merely produce growth, it built a prosperous and sustainable society in which economic gains were converted into long-term well-being for the people. And it is precisely those foundations, education, technology, work culture, national savings, long-term oriented companies that continue to keep Japan standing strong even after growth has slowed. The miracle no longer continues with the intensity of the 1960s, but its imprint is still present in every aspect of Japanese life today. Looking back at that entire journey, from the ashes of 1945 to the pinnacle of global technology, the Japanese miracle leaves a cold but clear message for the world today. Japan proved that a nation can be rebuilt from absolute zero in less than 2 decades if it has 3 things: the right technology, the right policies, and a society disciplined to the point of treating growth as a collective duty. No oil, no steel, no resources, no sovereignty, yet Japan still built the most competitive industrial base in the world. However, Japan also proved something else, less often mentioned. Every miracle has limits. When the population began to shrink, the economy lost its natural engine for consumption and production. When technological innovation shifted from hardware to software, Japan, strong in precision manufacturing, slowed down. When lifetime employment, keiretsu, and rigid organizational culture blocked risk-taking and creativity, Japan could not produce an internet revolution like Silicon Valley. The miracle did not collapse. It simply reached the saturation point of the curve, like every human-made system, and at this point, Japan's story becomes more worth reflecting on than ever, because the world today is entering an era that resembles the world of 1950, a fragmented world. The United States and China are competing not only militarily but over chips, robots, AI, and supply chains. Nations are reviving industrial strategies, subsidies, protectionism, technology controls, the very tools Japan once used to regenerate its economy. Global supply chains that once ran smoothly are now shattering under geopolitical pressure, pandemics, and energy crises. In that context, many countries are trying to find their own miracle, from India with semiconductors, Vietnam with electronics manufacturing, to Europe trying to revive green technology. But the lesson from Japan is far colder. Miracles are engineered. There are no natural miracles. There is no free growth. Everything is the result of choices, of sacrifices, of discipline, and of political decisions that are not always pleasant. And the final lesson is even sharper. Every engineered miracle has a cost and an expiration date. Japan paid the price with decades of extreme social discipline, a rigid labor market, enormous internal pressure, and creativity that was stifled as it entered maturity. But in return, they got peace, prosperity, and a civilized society that most of the world can only dream of. In an era of fragmented geopolitics, where power is seized through chips, data, robots, and energy, the Japanese story is not nostalgia for a golden age, it is a warning for the future. If you want to understand the future of global power, look at the country that rose from the ashes and challenged the great powers without firing a single shot. Thank you for following to the end of the story. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next analyses. See you again on the journey to explore the economic power of nations.